Welcome to week 5 of our study of Firm Foundation, How to Study the Literary Genres of Scripture. My name is Melanie Rainer, and I am the Ministry Director at the Cool Springs location of Christ Presbyterian Church. And it is a joy to be with you today to talk about the biblical genre of poetry. This is the genre of the Bible that sets my heart on fire. I love it so much. I am a writer, and nothing moves me more than a creative turn of phrase, a perfect metaphor, or a clever way of shaping a sentence. Some of my favorite passages of Scripture are poems, like the Christ hymn in Colossians 1 or Jonah's prayer in Jonah's 2. The Bible is full of poetry. Here are some ways that poets and scholars have defined poetry in general, not biblical poetry, but poetry over the years. Edgar Allan Poe called it the rhythmical creation of beauty. Paul Engel said, "Poetry is ordinary language raised to the nth power. Poetry is boned with ideas, nerved and blooded with emotions, all held together by the delicate, tough skin of words." Thomas Hardy wrote, "Poetry is emotion put into measure." Emily Dickinson said, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know it is poetry." I could go on, but these words capture a little bit of the essence of poetry, the gift that it is to all who read it. You may be thinking, poetry isn't really my thing, and that's okay. But I'd ask you to think about the things that do give you that quickening jolt of beauty. Maybe it's fly fishing in the cold mountain air, or standing at the edge of the ocean in the sandy Gulf, or staring at a masterpiece in an art museum. Maybe it's as simple as watching your children or grandchildren laugh, or you find it stirring the right amount of love and spices into a pot of marinara sauce. Beauty is everywhere, and God is the center of it. And so it checks out that the greatest book ever written, the gift of God to his people, the God that created sunsets and mountain ranges, who quite literally invented beauty, contains poetry. When we think about poetry in the Bible, we typically think first about the Psalms. Leland Ryken estimates that up to 1/3 of the Bible is poetry. He said, 1/3 of the Bible is not too high an estimate. Whole books of the Bible are poetic. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. A majority of Old Testament prophecy is poetic in form. Jesus is one of the most famous poets of the world. Beyond these predominantly poetic parts of the Bible, figurative language appears throughout the Bible, and whenever it does, it requires the same type of analysis given to poetry. So what special treatment do we give to poetry when we read as opposed to another genre of Scripture? Let's look at a few quick principles for reading poetry, and we'll use Psalm 19, our text in today's workbook, as an exercise throughout. So here are 2 quick principles for reading poetry in the Bible. First, read it differently than other genres of Scripture. Second, read it the same as other genres of Scripture. And I'll unpack those here for us. First, we read poetry differently than we read other genres of Scripture. Why? Because it is different. This is where a study Bible or another tool can come in really handy. Utilize the work of scholars to enhance your own reading of poetry in Scripture. I came up with a little device to help you when you read poetry. Okay? Write this down. Think A, B, C, D. A, read it aloud. B, look for biblical references. C, examine the couplets. And D, find literary devices. Let's break that down together. A, read it out loud. Read the poem aloud. Or you can use an app like Dwell or the ESV Bible app or another app that will read it out loud to you. Listen to the poem. Listen to the way the phrases are constructed, the way that they build upon each other. Close your eyes and picture the imagery the poem creates. Ask yourself how the experience differs when you read it versus when you hear it. Remember that until the Gutenberg printing press was invented in the 1500s, the vast majority of people only ever heard Scripture. For most of the history of the Bible, it was an auditory experience, not a visual one. And poetry, when we listen to it, it opens up new ways of understanding and hearing. So A, read it aloud. B, biblical references. This one you use for every genre of Scripture, but I love it particularly for poetry. Why? Because poets are masters of language, and they often take the familiar and use a different turn of phrase or emphasis to highlight a new meaning. This is especially true in some of the Bible's most beautiful poetic prayers. One of my favorite examples of this is Jonah's prayer, which he prays from the belly of the big fish. Almost every single line in this epic poem is a line lifted directly from the Psalms. It's so cool. And if you're wondering, how do I do this? How do I find biblical references and see them in these verses in the Psalms? This is where a study Bible can come in really handy. You can also use the ESV Online, esv.org, which has all of the cross-reference passages hyperlinked. So if you're reading a verse and you see a little hyperlink, you can click on it and it'll show you where that verse appears somewhere else in Scripture. It's also free, which is really great. So let's do this, look at Bible references in Psalm 19. And we'll do this by looking at a couple of places where this psalm is cross-referenced. Both happen to be in the book of Romans. First, Paul uses the idea of Romans 19:1 in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, emphasizing that God's glory is evident by the works of his hands. Paul writes, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." Where David wrote, "The sky proclaims his handiwork," Paul translated it to, God's eternal power and divine nature are shown in the things that he made since the creation of the world. David was writing poetry, a song made to be heard and prayed over God's people. Paul was writing an epistle, translating this ancient theology into practice for new Christians in Rome. Their message, however, is the same. We are witness to God's glory through the world that he created. Second, Psalm 19 is directly quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 10, when Paul is explaining how many people had heard the gospel truth and did not follow it. In 10:18, Paul quotes Psalm 19:4. He says, "But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." Paul goes on to quote two other Old Testament passages right after this, and you could chase these ideas back and forth throughout Scripture for a very long time. Biblical references, especially in poetry, can honestly provide hours of rabbit trails, but even a quick glance can illuminate a thought and help you see the through line of significant ideas throughout Scripture. Okay, so A, read aloud. B, look for biblical references. C, couplets. This one is very poetry specific. And for this one, we're going back to English class for a moment. Couplets are key building blocks of poetry in the Bible. A single couplet is made up of 2 lines of poetry. In biblical poetry, this is the primary constructive device. There is a fantastic video from the guys at the Bible Project called "How to Read the Art of Biblical Poetry" that explains this really well. So I would encourage you to go look that up and watch it to learn more. But the basic idea is that in a couplet, the first line makes a statement, and the second line enhances that statement. It can enhance it by clarifying, by repeating, by contrasting. Let's take a quick look at Psalm 19:1, and we'll actually practice this together. "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." The first phrase explains the heavens declare God's glory, and the second builds upon it, emphasizing the same idea, by stating it in a different way. The sky proclaims his handiwork. So when you're reading biblical poetry, most of the time you should be able to break it down into these couplets and note how the second phrase interacts with the first. You can do this all the way through Psalm 19 on your own time or in your group, and I guarantee it will be a really eye-opening experience about how these couplets help emphasize the key ideas the psalmist is saying. So we've done 3 of the ABCD method: aloud, biblical references, couplets, and D, devices. Back to English class again. Biblical poetry often contains literary devices designed to emphasize certain ideas. Here are a few examples from Psalm 19. Simile. A simile is a phrase that compares 2 unlike things to create a stronger image. It often uses the word like to make a comparison. In Psalm 19, we see one in verses 4 and 5. The sun which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber. The image of the sun rising is likened to a groom getting ready to meet his bride. Personification. Personification gives human attributes to something non-human, and biblical poetry is full of this literary device. Verse 5 goes on to do this with the sun. Like a strong man runs its course with joy. The sun is compared to a man running a race. Repetition. There are many forms of repetition, from words that happen over and over at the beginning or the end of phrases, or using different words that mean the same thing. For example, in Psalm 19, we see 6 different words used that all mean the same thing: God's law. In verses 7 through 10, we see law, testimony, precepts, commandment, fear, and rules. If you are studying this passage in depth, one way that you could tease out the meaning of this repetition would be to look at the repeated idea and what it does. The Bible scholar Derek Kidner suggests it this way. Take each noun, which is a different word for law, then look at the verb and the adjective that describe it. So the law is perfect. It revives the soul. The precepts are right. They rejoice the heart. And on and on. By breaking these couplets down into their repeated pattern, we see how the psalmist used repetition to create a vivid image of the beauty and importance of God's law. If hearing things audibly is a little bit harder, you can make a chart. This is how I would do this, because sometimes when I hear ideas, it's a lot harder for me to remember them than when I write them down. So if I had a whiteboard, I would draw a table that said noun, adjective, verb. And I would go through each couplet and break it down. What's the noun used for law? What adjective describes it? And what noun, or what verb, helps us understand how it is applied into our life? There are so many other literary devices used in the Psalms, and this is another place where utilizing a study Bible or a commentary can help you identify more and more of what the author was doing. Okay, so now we've gone through A, B, C, D. Read it aloud, look up Bible references, break down the couplets, and look for devices. I hope that's a helpful tool for you to keep in mind whenever you study biblical poetry. So the second principle for reading poetry in the Bible that I want us to briefly look at is read it the same way that you read the rest of Scripture. So first read it differently than the rest of Scripture, then read it the same way. Hear me out. Because it can be really fun to get lost in the weeds of poetry, to spend so much time unpacking each word and phrase, to mine out all of its deeper meaning that you risk missing the forest for the trees. And so it matters that we also approach poetry with the same basic principles as we'd read any other book of the Bible. My typical rule of thumb is based on the fallen condition focused practice that I learned in seminary. And you ask 3 questions of every passage of Scripture. What does it say about God? What does it say about us and our sin nature? And how does it instruct us to respond? So in Psalm 19, we can answer these questions that help us fit these 14 verses inside the entire redemptive narrative arc of Scripture. Nothing in Scripture stands alone. It is all pointing to the great mercy of God through his Son, Jesus. Psalm 19 tells us a lot about God. It shows that he reveals his glory to us through creation and through his law, which was his perfect design for human flourishing, it primarily does this in verses 1 through 11. Then Psalm 19 tells us a lot about us. Starting in verse 11, it shows us how hard it is to follow God's law. The psalmist's journey in verse 11 through 14 through the impacts and guilt of not following God's law. Who can discern his errors? Keep me from my hidden sins. And finally, Psalm 19 shows us how to respond, praying that the Lord would accept the psalmist's actions, words, and motivations as pleasing. Verse 14, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight. And what word does this psalm end with? The most precious of words. The promise that God made reaching all the way back to Genesis. Redeemer. The Son he would send to fulfill the law, to reveal his glory, to redeem his people forever. The Bible is so amazing. We're barely even scratching the surface of Psalm 19, which is one of the reasons why I love Scripture so much. Studying it never gets old. It is always new. And maybe thinking about the Bible as being so full of poetry is new for you. And I'd encourage you to lean in. See how the Lord uses the beauty of language to awaken something new in your heart. C.S. Lewis described poetry in the Psalms as a little incarnation, giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible. This is the lesson of Psalm 19, revealing to us God's glory made manifest in the created world. And this is the lesson of poetry in the Bible, a gift written for us by the God who loves